Now, a decade ago, protest action emerged at various tertiary institutions across the country. Students at Wits University started to protest against high fees as well as financial exclusion. Dubbed the hashtag Fees Must Fall movement, protest action dominoed to other institutions and the resistance spread across the country. Now, the weeks that followed, students saw, and there were police clashes rather, as university management tried to negotiate for a resolution. As the protests and sit-ins continued, civil society, political parties and the general public provided support and aid for demonstrators, those who were arrested and injured, and those who faced academic exclusion. Well, now let's reflect on this conversation. We are joined by Dr. Rekgotsofetse Chikane, who's also with the Wits School of Governance. He's also penned a book and he'll be speaking to us about those events and other events around Fees Must Fall. Dr. Chikane, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this morning. Now, you've penned a book that is about rebuilding the nation and just looking back at Fees Must Fall and some of the events that led up to Fees Must Fall. I mean, there were protests such as Stain Must Fall at the University of the Free State, Afrikaans Must Fall, the tax uprising at the University of Pretoria, and of course, the Roads Must Fall, Oxford. And you compare these protests to those of 1976 and the student uprising. And you refer to the leaders of these current protests to be those led by coconuts, as you refer to them. Just talk to us about the times that you remember when Fees Must Fall began. Who was at the forefront and really what were the main grievances of these students?
Yeah, no, so thanks for having me. And thank you for reminding me about the book. So, I mean, one could think of it a bit differently. So since 2000, leading up to 2015, there had been a protest with the intent of shutting down a university every single year, right? Whether it is for fee-related issue or finance-related issue, there had been a protest every single year related to the idea that people are being financially excluded from the university or people can't find their place in the university. And what made 2015 different was that it culminated, that 15-year period of protest activity across universities across the country, all culminated in the moment in which students said enough is enough. And I think that moment marked a breaking point in a generation's thought process about what this country is supposed to look like. That you can't have your number one tool of getting out of poverty being getting a university degree. And the number one reason why you can't get a university degree is that you're in poverty. And that dynamic, that little challenge, that conundrum, was something that we realized is like that internal contradiction with the country. And I think back in 2015 in particular, you had a generation of students who decided to call out that contradiction and say enough's enough. It wasn't just coconuts. In the book, I talk about that it is funny that it is different that you had students from the most privileged backgrounds joining the protest. And the question then becomes, why is it that when they join, it gets this national resonance that when they didn't join, it didn't? But also, what are the dangers of it as well? And I think it's a lasting legacy on our generation, but it's also a legacy that we kind of need to hold on to going forward as well.
Of course. I mean, you were one of those leaders who led this movement. And I mean, over the past 10 years, what do you consider one of, or some of the most significant achievements of the Fees Must Fall movement? How has it influenced policies at universities in our country?
Yeah, so there's multiple ways. I love this question. So one is that the culture of universities has changed. So the manner in which one would approach fee-related issues at the university before 2015 was very different to how universities approach it now. Before 2015, a university vice-chancellor could just simply ignore students, right? That the SRC could give representations about what needs to be done, how it should be done, and they would just be completely ignored. The entire process of negotiating fees has also been altered because of the realization that it wasn't a fair negotiation in a particular way. There's also a change in culture that you see universities making an active efforts to ensure that there's a level of dignity among students. Now, does this happen across all universities? Absolutely not. But you can see that change in culture. You can also see an active attempt by certain universities to alter their curriculum as well. It wasn't just Fees Must Fall asking for free education, they were asking for free decolonised education as well. So you can see universities aspiring towards how do you diversify the curriculum, how do you diversify the space and what person's in. Have we won the fight? We're so far from it. And now we're facing grander issues around systemic injustices within the country, financial constraints that universities have, and the financial reality that South Africa is also just not in a great space. And the government can't do its job, and it can't do the stuff that we need them to do. Universities are struggling with this tension about how do you push these successes of 2015, 2016, 2017? How do you not go out of business as well? Because it's a tough job for a university vice chancellor to have to kind of balance these books with these competing demands by students. And a lot more could be done. We still don't really have free education. It's still packaged in a manner that it's not free for all. And we can have a discussion about why it should be free for all. But it's something that we're moving along in the right path, but we're really hitting the struggles about the constraints the country has in general, not just the higher education sector.
You now sit on the other end as a lecturer at Wits University. How do you see the movement having affected student engagement and activism within our universities? Have you seen a change in the way students participate in these social justice issues?
So in multiple ways, you're now making me feel much older than I should feel, but in multiple ways. So one, in the period immediately after fees must fall, you found a greater antagonistic relationship between students and management before, because a tool of protest had been unlocked at universities that usually wasn't utilized, which is the previously white institutions would be shut down by protesters. So you saw this in 2017, 2018, 2019. COVID then changes things a bit, and you get a new generation of students who come in, but they are acutely aware about the fight that happened in 2015, and you can see that happening in the rhetoric that they utilize around how they engage in student politics, how they talk about student politics. Thereafter, I've now gotten a bit too old, so I'm not sure how the current day student activists would be negotiating and interacting with management. What I do know is that they are not afraid of shutting down the university, but it's no longer the first tool at their disposal. They've kind of gone back into, let's negotiate with the university before we shut down the university. And I think you can only do that if the university's changed its position around how it negotiates with students.
I mean, you spoke of we still have a very long way to go, and how education has just been made a commodity as opposed to a basic right for children in South Africa. Talk to us about some of the challenges that you faced as some of the leaders of the Fees Must Fall movement, and how these challenges shaped your strategies and your objectives.
Yeah, so I'm different. I come from a very, very privileged background, right? So I come from a family that was heavily involved in politics in one way or another. And I came from a family that had the means. And the question that I always used to ask was, once you realize, and I go back to that point, because often South Africans forget how unequal the country is, that if you get a degree in our country, in general, you'll get a job, right? That the unemployment rate between people who have a university degree and the unemployment rate between people who don't have a university degree is chalk and cheese. We're talking single digits versus 30, 40%, right? So you might not get a job immediately, but you will get a job. And because the majority of people going into university are first generation students who are getting a job for the first time in their lives, right? And it means that you get some of the highest return on your income on your education in the world. And that's because of the low base that we have, right? So the question then gets confronted by a lot of students is, how is it possible that the number one way to get out of, the number one reason why people are not graduating from university is not academic reasons. The academic reasons are far down. The number one reason people are not finishing university is a financial reason. And the question then becomes, how do you have that system perpetuate that to get out of poverty, you need a university degree, but you can't get out of university because you don't have the means to get out of university because of finances. And that tension is what brought people in. It wasn't just that an individual struggle that people were experiencing. It was the realization by an entire generation of students that this is a systemic issue that needs all hands on deck. It doesn't matter what your privileged background was. It doesn't matter what school you went to. If you don't solve this, it creates longer challenges for the country in the long term. So a student such as myself, who went to one of the private schools of the country, who went to UCT, was able to sit back and say that this doesn't matter. Like, my personal individual whatever success doesn't matter if the country doesn't move forward as well. I don't want to leave the country. They've got no desire to do that. But you can't then allow the country to kind of stay in a status quo. You need a change in mindset. And that's just my perspective. And you can get many other perspectives of students who came from very difficult backgrounds who realized that they're willing to risk it all. That was the one major thing amongst all of us, that they had an entire generation who's willing to get kicked out of university because we knew what we believed in.
Right.
Whether the country liked us or not. And it's an energy that I think we should still hold on to.
We certainly should. I mean, just speaking of that energy, Dr. Chikane, I mean, we know that this movement really does reflect on the broader socio-economic issues in our country, such as inequality and access to education. And of course, there's that missing middle that we're constantly talking about that isn't catered for by NSFAS. We have the South African Union of Students that has put together a proposal where they're saying that government departments should all just club in money, whether it's municipalities, or the access funds that they have in order to channel this, especially for those children within the missing middle. Do you think that there's a political will in really ensuring that students get these funds that they need?
So there's a lack of political will. So that's a definite. So the ANC in its conference in 1997, if I'm not mistaken, made an initial promise for free education. In Stellenbosch, they made a second promise for a form of free education. And then in Polokwane in 2007, they've made a firm commitment as a policy that we will have free education. And indeed, free education wasn't given, right? So there's a lack of political will until former President Jacob Zuma came in and like the last second kind of opened up the doors, but in a manner that created other problems, right? So state constraints and financing constraints around how you fund free education. The question then becomes, whether it's the missing middle, whether it is people above that, the question isn't about how government gives money. It's really about the funding model. And the funding model that we've been utilizing in the past, right, just wasn't functioning in the manner in which you want it to function. And there's a ton of proposals. We had an entire commission that spoke about all the different proposals. What was funny is that we gave a proposal back in 2012, 2011, which eventually became the model that the country utilized in 2017, right? So it's not that students can't give you models as well. And we need to start exploring different models outside of government funding. Like one old age argument was a graduate's tax, for instance. So it's not a loan that students have, but you allow SARS to come into the picture. NSFAS till this day still doesn't really function with SARS in a manner that makes sense, right? So once we get the funding model right, the financing model right for this, we can then start tiering up to different income brackets of students. The missing middle, that pressure of this missing middle is not just a university issue. It hits housing issues. It hits education issues at a basic level. It hits healthcare. The missing middle in South Africa is creating an increased inequality gap because they're all moving downwards. You're no longer just the missing middle, you're just below middle, if that makes sense. And that's a general societal problem that South Africans are facing. And it's something that we need to think carefully about how we resolve going forward.
Lastly, Dr. Chikane, what do you think are the steps that need to be taken in order to ensure that the spirit of Fees Must Fall continues and that we inspire future generations to become such student activists?
Yeah, so the unashamedly I advertised the book. So the book that I wrote was called Breaking a Rainbow, Building a Nation. And the underlying logic was, don't be beholden to the successes of ending apartheid in the moment of 1994, right? That was just the first big step in many big steps that an entire generation needs to take to undo the legacies of the past. But to do that means you can't be a prisoner of the moment. You can't be the prisoner of rhetoric of everything is fine in the country in one way or another because we're all united. And we're seeing that change in logic. The country's changing its mindset about what the status quo of the country should look like. The last election kind of showed us that. And I think for the generation of students who are coming into university this year, they need to ask themselves is the culture, the institution of universities in South Africa, whether it's finance related or non-finance related, suitable for building the country that you want? And having the confidence to have that conversation. It doesn't mean you have to protest, right? That protest doesn't also necessarily have to be the tool of last resort, but it means, are you aware about what you want the university to be? be in the future and what kind of country you want to be in, even as a 19-year-old, and realizing that you have the power to create that so long as the institutions are geared towards it. And I think that's what we kind of need from any activists across the country, of challenging institutions that are not allowing South Africa to move forward, challenging individuals inside institutions who are engaging in activities that are not moving the country forward, and being emboldened and having the courage to essentially call truth to power. And I think that's what we need in the country, and I think it is happening in pockets, and I think it will grow as time goes on.
Certainly, you have started a movement there. Dr. Chikane, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this morning. That was former #FeesMustFall activist, Dr. Rekgotsofetse Chikane. He also is a contributor to the book Fees Must Fall, Student Revolt, Decolonisation and Governance in South Africa. And he's also currently a lecturer at the Wits School of Governance.